Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk a little bit about what I call the Century of Terror. 100 years ago, we were embroiled in a world war. In fact, it was the last year of what we called World War I. A terrific, terrible, horrendous, bloody war that need not have happened because there were no bad guys in World War I. Not at all. The interesting thing is this, that basically many of the people fighting in Europe were related. Kaiser Wilhelm was Queen Victoria's favorite grandson, and the King of England and the Tsar of Russia, were cousins, and a number of other individuals involved were all related to the royal family of England that was actually German. It's kind of bizarre. And of course the United States gets involved, which I think is a terrible mistake. You see, World War I was an extension of the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. The French and the Germans had been battling back and forth for years. And the French were angry because the French invaded Prussia, by the way. It wasn't that the Germans, which would soon become the Germans, attacked France. It was the other way around. And within 3 weeks, the French army was defeated, and Napoleon, their leader, was under house arrest. And it was a humiliation for France because they looked like damn fools. And Germany was created at Versailles, because that's where everything ended up, because they had taken over the country after being invaded, and then they created Germany. Well, of course, World War I would start, and through the assassination of, the Archduke Ferdinand, who was assassinated, and he was kind of, in a sense, a minor political figure. And there were individuals that started a rapid-fire declaration of war, and like dominoes, everything flew, and Franz Joseph, that senile old fart, he's one of the people that really started things, and of course Russia got involved. It's interesting to note that Kaiser Wilhelm was sending telegrams saying, "Stop this nonsense," but nobody listened, and eventually they all blamed him for it, interestingly enough. But I must say that 100 years ago, this dreadful war had been going on for 3 years. The loss of life was horrendous. Every new technology was used. And we had a president of the United States who was, I really truly believe, a cup and saucer short of a full place setting, Woodrow Wilson. A disaster. He was a doctor of history. Therefore, he didn't listen to people because he was a PhD. Therefore, everyone needed to listen to him. And that's how he believed. That's how he did things. And of course, we were neutral, but we secretly were favoring England. That's not neutral. And the Lusitania was sunk. It was filled with munitions that were going to England. The Germans had every right to sink it because the United States was lying. And Woodrow Wilson was lying. And Woodrow Wilson was an individual who never should have been president, as far as I'm concerned. He was very much like Theodore Roosevelt. They were kindred spirits. That's why they hated each other. Just Theodore Roosevelt was just a little bit more bull than moose, as Harry S. Truman used to say. But the thing is that Theodore Roosevelt destroyed William Howard Taft, and by doing so, made Woodrow Wilson president. And it was this crazed individual who was president during World War I have tried to find ways to look at what Wilson did in a favorable way, but I can't. He's an embarrassment. You know, when the war ended, November 11th, 1918, which was based on Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, by the way. He wrote up his 14 points. As Clemenceau from France said that God had 10 commandments, but Wilson has 14. And Germany looked at them and said, we are willing to have an armistice, which is not a surrender, by the way, through Wilson's 14 points. Well, Europe had no intention of doing anything that Wilson wanted, because they looked at him as a damn fool. And Wilson came over, and he was feted as the greatest man in the world, and he developed what you might call a Christ complex. He was a Presbyterian minister's son, and he suddenly discovered that he was the man to save the world, and he looked at himself that way. Therefore, he didn't have Congress, he didn't have people working with him. He became our Caesar. And that's no way a republic operates. And of course he went to Versailles for the Treaty of Versailles, which was one of the worst documents ever made. And the Europeans ate Wilson alive. He argued, and they just didn't listen to him. He lectured at them. They didn't listen. They didn't want to be lectured to. They were there for revenge. Wilson was there with his Christ complex, there to save the world. He ended up looking like a damn fool. In fact, he left the whole conference a destroyed man. Came back to the United States, and they weren't happy either. Congress was not at all happy because Wilson had totally bypassed them on everything. Wars are declared, peace is declared by acts of Congress, not the president. And he left them completely out of the loop. Therefore, they finished what the Europeans started on Wilson. They ate him up completely and left Wilson a shattered, destroyed, and disillusioned, and lastly, angry man. Now, the actions of all of this, the terrible things that happened in Versailles, which guaranteed there's going to be a whole bunch of wars. The United States never should have been involved in World War I. There was no reason for us to be here. It was an extension of the Franco-Prussian War. And the reason why the whole thing was at Versailles is, remember, that's where Germany was created in 1871. And they wanted to really let Germany have it. And Germany agreed for an armistice. And the Allies looked at it as a surrender. And for the last 100 years, we have had a reign of terror. Because I must tell you, World War I, it never ended. Sure, the fighting on the fields of France stopped November 11, 1918. But the fighting, the wars, the animosity, the invasions continued. The United States was in Russia in 1919. We were involved in China, all over. We're in Mexico. Many other places. Other countries were invading. And all of this was going on after the war to end all wars, as Woodrow Wilson put it. But Woodrow Wilson truly screwed up. Clemenceau screwed up. David Lloyd George screwed up. And instead of bringing Germany into the equation and working on a peaceful armistice, they created a vengeful and angry takeover, guaranteeing that wars would continue, guaranteeing that animosity would continue. And out from this kitchen called Versailles came Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, and the crazy Middle East. All of this due to this group of arrogant individuals who didn't know what they were doing in many respects. Yes, they were leaders. Yes, they understood their governments, but they didn't understand the world or world policies or cultures. And they caused an awful lot of problem. And so I just wanted to think about this, since it is 2018 and we're looking at the last year of what was World War I. And just to think that World War I is still going on and will go on as long as we go on. That's one of the sad facts, one of the unfortunate facts of that bloody, dreadful conflict that totally changed the world forever. We don't realize that. But this world is not the world that existed before 1914. And the world that existed after 1919 was ugly. It was frightening. It was one filled with terror, with war, petulance. And one that will seem to continue until man no longer exists on the face of this earth.